Continuing our discussions of processes, as we look at Chapter 6, we're going to see a focus on the overall concept of process thinking and incorporate that into our way of how processes fit into businesses and how businesses use them. We'll spend a little time talking about process flows and flow charting, as well as process analysis, and wind up emphasizing the concept of business process reengineering as a way of improving not only our processes but our capabilities. In the area of process thinking, a very popular concept is all work can be seen as a process. No matter what you do it as a process. Sometimes you do it over and over again the same way. Other times, each time you do it may be a little different. Hopefully when you're doing that, you're trying to improve it or streamline it. A system, today almost everything we do is systematically. And there's two aspects to that that are very important. One is that, like a process, a system has to go in certain sequences and the tasks have to interrelate. But even more important than that, the parts of a system have to come together. We talked about linkage, we talked about the interrelationship of things. Today we're in a systematic world, and the best way to look at it is like the parts of a watch. You know, the watch isn't going to work. You can't tell the time unless all the parts are moving at the same time and in the same direction. That's the way a business works too. And that's why we emphasize cross-functionality in a system sense. It has to include everybody working at the same time and part of the same processes. Okay, there's several different ways of measuring process flows, but what you want to look at in this chapter is Little's Law, which relates items in the system to rate and length of time in the system. We're not going to spend time here in the formula, but it is an important concept from a point of view of controlling the flow. You're looking at your capability, your process capabilities, the waiting lines, the invoice processing. These are different places where the law can be used. Office transactions, account receivable processing. These are all processes, and the way you measure them is important. You have to take into consideration the capacities in a system, and just like factories, systems do have capacities. They also always run into things called bottleneck, and there's a very good study on this called The Theory of Constraints by a man, Elijah Goldratt, that has become very popular in this area. Flow rates are important in terms of supply, demand, and capacity. And one of the methods that you design and define process is through a flow chart. It's a visual diagram that describes the process, and it's referred to sometimes as mapping, charting, can be blueprinting, or value streaming. These are all identifications of it. You want to find ways to improve the current process, so you have to go and try to identify first what the existing process is, then analyze it, diagnose it, and try to identify corrective actions to it. Process flow might change depending on those corrective actions. what do you look at in order to do it? You can look at the types of raw materials, the design of the product or the system output, the process design and what steps are used. You look at any part or element of a process to determine how to change it. There are certain steps that have been recognized as part of flow charting for a systems approach. You select the process, you develop a team to analyze it, you specify the boundaries of or the limits of the transformation process, identify the sequential operational steps, and you identify the performance metrics, and eventually draw the flow chart. A lot of symbols that are pretty standardized in any flow charting. Many different reports that are incorporated. But the most important things that you're looking for is the typical what, who, where, when, and how type of questions that you want to try to answer. And the elements that you're dealing with are the flow, the time elements, the quantity that's involved, a quality aspect in terms of defects or bottlenecks, and the cost elements. They're very common to most of those system considerations. Now, business process re-engineering is something relatively new, and by that it was defined in 1993, and it represents a philosophy just like TQM and many other concepts are philosophies. And it's been very much used in more recent years. And basically it's defined as fundamental rethinking and redesign of business processes. So what you're basically doing is taking another look at what you do and try to say, how can I improve it? PR is a re-engineering concept. It's not really a change to continuous improvement or other concepts, but it's unique in comparison to them. It's a perspective, and the old comparison of is the glass half empty or half full. It's putting a perspective on it, and sometimes you may be coming to the conclusion you're looking at the wrong elements. Maybe the glass itself is not the right glass, or even a liquid that's in there. So from a BPR point of view, it's causing you to rethink some of the aspects from the traditional way. It's focused on outcomes, not so much the tasks that are involved, but what are the results. It looks at resources, like do you have the right people who do the right work from an informational point of view. And today, we're more and more dependent on information for our decision making, that becomes even more important. And one of the things that it emphasizes is actually two things. One, eliminate unnecessary steps. Secondly, build controls into the process to stabilize them. A lot of mistakes come out of trying to incorporate not just BPR, but a lot of corrective actions, such as continuous improvement. There's a difference between fixing a process and changing it. We're using the old-fashioned Band-Aid versus surgery comparison. But you need to focus more on the process itself. So you can't be too widespread in your approach. You have to consider all inputs, including people inputs, their values, their attitudes, and you can't come to early conclusions and jump to those conclusions, because if you're wrong, you'll just decide that the system doesn't work instead. Culture and attitudes are very important. as you're dealing with processes and systems, you have to recognize that the human element is a very important part of it. And another very important thing, when you re-engineer something, you don't try to fix things from a bottom up. You should always start at the top, drive it from the top of the organization down into the organization. You'll find that the results are much better, and you accomplish what you're trying to accomplish more often that way. Leadership's important in these groups. Don't try to do too much at one time. Don't allow yourself to get distracted. And especially when you meet resistance, you have to think carefully how to deal with the resistance factor, because it will be there.